Okay, so we are here today. Welcome to today's event for Advancing Anti-Racism and Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in STEM Organizations, a dialogue with the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, a webinar in collaboration with the National Academies. So, let me advance my slide. My name is Daniela Bernal. I am Director of Member Services at SACNAS. Before we begin, we would like to start the way we start most of SACNAS events with a brief land acknowledgement. SACNAS is a fully inclusive organization dedicated to achieving true diversity in STEM. As the nation's largest multicultural and multidisciplinary STEM diversity organization, SACNAS creates space where all members, volunteers, and partners can feel they belong and embrace their intersectional identities. SACNAS is based out of California, which is the original homeland to over 200 tribal nations, bands, and rancherias of Native American and Indigenous people. We like to take this time to acknowledge the original caretakers of our lands, which we all live and work, and honor the rich culture of the Indigenous peoples across the country. There is a link on the screen if you'd like to check out and learn more about the lands you reside in, visit, and are around. With that, I am very excited to welcome you to today's event. I'm going to share very quickly about today's agenda, and I'm going to introduce the wonderful folks you see here on your screen and share a little bit about how we can interact throughout today's webinar. When we get to the Q&A, you are invited to submit your questions directly in the Q&A feature. It's usually at the bottom of your Zoom navigation. If you submitted a question when you registered, I have those, so you don't need to resubmit unless you want to. And as questions come up, feel free to just start putting those in the Q&A throughout the presentation. After the Q&A, we'll close with some useful links and resources, so make sure you stay for those. And then throughout the day, or this hour together, we'd love for you to interact in the chat. Please, the introductions are wonderful. It's lovely to see where people are joining from. And as always, we encourage you to be polite and respectful. There's the emoji reactions as well, and you can use those as well. Now, for those joining us on the SACNAS webinar for the very first time, welcome. I'm going to share very quickly about SACNAS, and then we will get to today's content. So we are a fully inclusive organization with nearly 10,000 members, 150 chapters across the country. We are a multicultural and multidisciplinary organization with many year-round programs, services, events, opportunities to be engaged. I definitely encourage, if you are not a SACNAS member already, to learn more about our organization on our website. We hope you might consider joining us at our upcoming conference. We recently celebrated 50 years of achieving true diversity, and we hope that you might join us in the next 50 years. With this context, it's absolutely my pleasure to welcome today's guest today. We have speakers joining us from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. Please join me in welcoming our speakers. We have Laura Castillo-Page, PhD, Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer with the Office of Diversity and Inclusion at the National Academies. We have Yamrot Neguse, MPH, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Program Manager with the Office of Diversity and Inclusion at the National Academies. And Emily Vargas, PhD, Program Officer with the Board on Behavioral, Cognitive, and Sensory Sciences at the National Academies. Welcome, and I'm going to pass it over to our speakers.
Great. Thank you, Daniela, for the kind introductions. And Emily's going to be sharing our slides. Thank you, Emily. Thank you to SACNAS for this partnership. Looking forward to just this being the beginning of us working closely over the years to come. And thank you to everyone joining us today to discuss our National Academies 2023 report, Advancing Anti-Racism, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in STEM Organizations Beyond Broadening Participation. And we're also going to be discussing how the report has guided our internal DEI efforts here at the National Academies. Emily will be providing a brief overview of the report, and Yami will be discussing how we have been applying the recommendations from the report to ourselves as a STEM organization. Next slide, please. But before we jump in, I'd like to take a few minutes to provide some helpful context by providing a quick overview regarding our organizational vision and capacity for DEI here at the National Academies. Many of you may know that one foundational step to advancing DEI in any organization is to develop a shared organizational vision for DEI and then building that capacity to accomplish that vision. So I'd like to share some of that with you here today. Next slide, please. For those of you not familiar with the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, here is our mission statement. We were established in 1863 by President Lincoln. We are not government. We are a private nonprofit institution that provides independent, objective analysis and advice to the U.S. to solve complex problems that inform public policy decisions related to science, engineering, and medicine. Next slide, please. So as part of our work to develop a shared organizational vision for DEI and to help us accomplish that broader mission that I just shared with all of you, just this past October, we had the opportunity to update our DEI statement and to develop new guiding principles for our work here at the Academies. You see listed here our new statement. It articulates that we value diversity, that we recognize that talent is broadly distributed in our society, and that many perspectives enhance the quality of our work and drive innovation and impact. It also includes our commitment to cultivate a culture of inclusion, belonging, accessibility, and anti-racism. And our statement also ties to our ability to fulfill our organization mission, which is to advise the nation on complex issues, but also doing that while embracing DEI values. Next slide, please. And these are our new principles that we also launched recently with our revised statement. I'm not going to read them fully, but just want to highlight that, our first principle is to integrate diverse perspectives and experiences into our programs, our policies, our practices, our products, to foster a culture of inclusion where everyone feels welcome, valued, respected, and like they belong, to approach scientific endeavors with a consideration of DEI frameworks, and to cultivate mutually beneficial, diverse partnerships and collaborations. So we created this revised statement and these guiding principles with partnership from across the entire organization. But I want to point out, because this is the first example, we also took guidance from the report, which we'll call for short here the ADEI report. And so this is the first example that I'd like to highlight that has shaped how we approach this work internally. Next slide, please. In addition to updating our statement and our guiding principles, in March, we launched our first ever National Academies DEI Action Plan that includes these 6 overarching goals. And if you're interested, I encourage you to read it. I think we'll be sharing it as a resource towards the end. The plan supports the broader organization strategic plan. It's a comprehensive, it's a 5-year plan that captures every part of the organization. And you'll find that the actions that are outlined in the plan are grounded in evidence and best practices for advancing a culture that prioritizes and values DEI. And again, this was another opportunity for us to look to the ADEI report to inform our action plan. Next slide, please. And if that didn't convince you that we really looked at this report very closely, in our action plan, we also added this particular action item, which is to identify and adopt relevant DEI and anti-racism policies and practices from National Academies reports. So our perspective is if we provide this guidance to others, we should also apply it to ourselves as well. Next slide, please. The ADI report is one of multiple examples where we as an institution have been looking to our programmatic work and the scientific evidence to inform our DI initiatives. You can see other resources here listed that we've also looked to. And later in the webinar, we'll specifically provide you more information. And so my colleague Yami will cover the more specific action items that we've taken from the report as they pertain to the 3 areas you see listed here around staff development and resources, pathway programs, and communication and accountability efforts. And so, but before we do that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Emily, and she's going to provide an overview of the report.
Thank you so much. All right, thank you, everyone. Thank you all for having us. As you heard, my name is Emily Vargas, and I was a staff member who worked on this report and helped see it through to publication. And as you heard, this was released in February 2023. And you may have seen this report. It is quite substantial in length, and so I don't have time today to go through all the specifics, but I'm going to go through some of the key findings, conclusions, and recommendations. And so here are the main points that I'm going to review today. I'm going to give you a little bit about the project background. We're going to talk about some of the chapters, including the historical and demographic context for racial inequality in STEM, racial bias and inequality, the role of STEM professionals and gatekeepers. We're going to then move up from the individual level to understanding teams, as well as the organizational leadership, and then move on to the research agenda. But first, before I go into the content, I want to take a moment to thank the many individuals and institutions that help make this work possible. So I want to take a moment to thank our 9 study sponsors. In addition, this work was made possible by our 18 committee members. Their bios are available in this report, and I encourage you to read all their expertise and the perspectives that they bring. So this is one half of the committee, and this is the other half. In addition, I want to take a moment to thank the study staff that helped make this work possible. So I'm going to begin by focusing on what's called the statement of task. And so I'm not going to dwell on each of these specific points. It is on this screen and then the next slide. But I want to make this known to you all because this is something that is unique to the National Academy's work, and it helps define the scope of what is included in this report. And I'm going to highlight 2 things. One is that this report focuses largely on the experience of Black Americans. And the second point is that this report includes an additional M in the title, and that is intentional, and that stands for medicine. And so these recommendations are supposed to be inclusive of medicine as well. And so this is the other half. So I want to begin by talking about the overall report structure. There are a total of 9 chapters, and it intentionally falls within this particular structure. And so we begin by talking about the historical and contemporary context that give rise to the disparities that exist today. And then we follow through the report by understanding the individual level experience and working our way up. So we begin by understanding individuals. How is it that they experience racism? How is it that racism is perpetuated? We understand the formation of how individuals come together to work on teams in STEM, and then focusing on the larger organizational level factors, including leadership and climate and cultural factors. So I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about each chapter, highlighting some of the key recommendations, and then talking about what the committee really wanted to highlight in each of these pieces. So as I said, we're going to begin with the history. The committee examined evidence on the historical context of the United States to understand the conditions that create the systemic barriers described within our statement of task. How is it that we got to where we are today? So when you read chapter 2, you'll notice that we cover evidence covering a range of institutions and sectors within society. We cover national laws and policies looking at education. We cover housing, employment, criminal justice, and health. The reason being is that all of these institutions underlie entry into STEM and lead us to where we are today. The report's first conclusion actually highlights that structural racism through these multiple institutions and sectors in society has harmed minoritized individuals, and the legacies actually continue into this day. One thing that I think in particular is really fascinating about this chapter is the role of minority serving institutions, as talking about the importance of them within this historical context. So the report states that even though minority serving institutions on average have continually faced underfunding, they've actually helped advance representation by helping many minoritized students obtain STEM degrees. So they are doing a fantastic job, and the committee wanted to recognize their efforts despite their underfunding. And so, since minority serving institutions are considered a critical resource, the committee actually put forward their first recommendation. They recommended 2 parts in recommendation 2.1. The first is to understand the secret sauce, so to speak. Federal funding agencies should provide increased opportunities for grants and forms of support to increase understanding of HBCUs and TCUs that support students and faculty. What is it that is working? We want to better understand this because it is really working really well. And the second part is that they call for predominantly white institutions to seek sustainable partnerships with minority serving institutions as a way to help diversify the pipeline. Chapter 3. We look at data on the demographic composition of the United States as a whole and in the United States workforce. Today, minoritized individuals account for 50% of the population that is 18 years and younger. If this current trend continues, minoritized individuals will account for a majority of the population of the United States between approximately years 2042 and 2045. This demographic shift in the committee's mind represents a real opportunity for the STEM workforce. But what's really important to know is that while this trend is happening, the growth in STEM in terms of numeric representation does not map onto the corresponding growth within the larger United States population. And so the recommendation presented out of Chapter 3 is understanding what is it that helps individuals persist. We want to make sure that we're not only able to get individuals into the door of STEM, so to speak, but we want to make sure that they are able to continue successfully over the course of their career or even their entire work career. So this recommendation states that to understand the relative persistence of students in STEM, the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics should collect information on the demographics of students entering and planning to study STEM and better understanding their education outcomes. Chapter 4, we take a very unique perspective as far as National Academies reports go, and we are tasked with exploring the lived experience. And so we actually did a series of structured interviews with Black STEM professionals who have reached elite statuses in their careers to better understand their lived experience as it relates to understanding representation and inclusion in STEM. And so this particular chapter is an accumulation of the interviews that we conducted and the themes that emerged from this particular interview data. So some of the themes include importance of belonging, the importance of mentors, having peers, understanding the resources that you may have at a minority serving institution. Just some examples. I'm actually going to share with you a quote that's from this particular chapter that highlights an experience that an individual had. Some senior people made it clear to me that, well, maybe I don't really belong there. I worked very hard, but some of them actually went out of their way to complain that I was publishing too many papers, that it must be that the quality was good. And so the committee really identified that lived experience and having a better understanding for minoritized groups is really essential to taking on anti-racism work. They actually concluded that oral history and other means of exploring the lived experiences of scholars from historically and systematically minoritized groups in STEM offer insights that supplement findings from other kinds of research, that this work should be continued and expanded. So continuing on from the perspective of the individual, Chapter 5 focuses really on the literature that is intentionally developed with the minoritized individual in mind. What does it mean to experience racism from an individual perspective? We understood it from a historical perspective, from a larger contextual perspective in Chapter 2, but what does it mean at an interpersonal level? That was the focus of Chapter 5. And so this is actually quite a substantial chapter in length, but it's broken into 3 parts. We talk about the adverse impacts of racism. There is a lot of literature here looking at how racism can impact individuals at a cognitive level, emotional, physiological, and also career-related outcomes. There are a range of adverse impacts. The second part of this chapter really examines how is it that minoritized individuals respond to racism. And generally, there are 3 outcomes. They either will likely exit the field, so leave STEM entirely, work to collectively transform and mobilize internally, or try to accumulate and fit in. And the third part is about how STEM professionals can help, given what this literature base says. And that's the base of the recommendations for this chapter. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'm going to highlight a couple of them. So first is about improving numeric diversity. So how many people are in the room, so to speak. The first bullet point here is about establishing information systems, identifying numeric disparities. And something that the committee found really important is understanding not just numeric disparities with the student body, but understanding where they exist all the way up at every level of positions. Relatedly, hire minoritized individuals at each level. So again, thinking about power and status, but with the aim to build a critical mass. You want to make sure that you're working with a group of individuals. You're not the only token. You're not the only individual there. representing a group of people. And incorporating examples of minoritized individuals who are role models. There's a large body of science that we cover in this report, talking about the importance of having role models as it relates to persistence in STEM. The second recommendation is related to connecting minoritized individuals to peers, resources, and networks. So we talk about in the report the science of summer bridge programs would have been implemented in a number of universities around the country, and those have been proven to be effective. Developing peer and near-peer mentorship programs. And of course, the one I'm going to highlight, forming relationships with national societies, such as SACNAS. And there's a reason that that's important is because you're connecting to a larger community beyond the four walls of your local institution to build a greater sense of a network, to build a greater connections within your particular field. Recommendation 5.4 is promoting inclusion, dignity, belonging, affirmations of kindness, not just being a number in the room, but what it means to be there, have those feelings of belonging. A couple of the bullet points that I'm going to highlight from this recommendation includes decentering white professional norms in a variety of ways, including, but not limited to, culture, dress, and appearance, emphasizing the importance of the roles that communal values have in STEM work, and actively recognizing minoritized individuals' contributions. So I'm going to move to chapter 6. So again, we're focusing on the individual level, but now we're focusing on how is it that racism is perpetuated at the individual level? What do we know? What the science says about this? And it's clear from the research that individuals, despite their best intentions, perpetuate racism. It is more ambiguous than people think. It is more ambivalent, but it's something that can be perpetuated quite easily. People are not good at tracking their own sense of bias. They're not good at understanding patterns of their own behavior. That's generally what the literature says. And so as a result, the committee recommended that we need to do a better job of collecting data on what kind of decisions are people making and understanding and using the data to better understand where instances of bias may be emerging. And so this recommendation is focused on just that, creating organizational level or unit level information systems to collect data on the decisions of what the committee is calling gatekeepers. So this is anyone with power who has the ability to shape an outcome that can, in fact, impact a minoritized individual in STEM. Data that's collected may include such hiring, admissions, promotion, tenure, advancement, and awards. And again, the point here is to understand the patterns of the behavior, look at it in the aggregate, and identify potential patterns of bias with the goal then of making changes where and when necessary. Chapter 7 is about moving up the ladder a little bit. So we looked at the individuals, we looked at individuals who may have experienced racism, how it's perpetuated, but what happens when you bring people together? A lot of the way that science is done nowadays, as you all know, is in teams. And so the research in this chapter shows that while there can be challenges, under ideal conditions, diverse teams can be leveraged to produce positive performance outcomes, generally more so than a team that is considered to be racially homogenous. And so there is a real potential benefit here, but it needs to be taken seriously and it needs to be done carefully. And that's what this chapter is focused on. In particular, this set of recommendations. It's about how do you bring individuals who come into the same team with different sets of lived experiences, with a different sort of backgrounds, and be able to accomplish the goals that you want them to do. And so there are 3 parts here as a way to develop teams that are not only diverse, but productive. And the first part here is to develop interdependent teams in which everyone is working toward a common goal that is well known, that is established. The second part is ensuring psychological safety among all of the team members. There's robust literature here underscoring the importance of having that within the team. And the third piece here is promoting equal status among the members, removing asymmetric power differentials among team members, especially among white and minoritized team members where power differentials may exist in the real world. And finally, we have chapter 8. This is focused on moving up the ladder, so we're focusing on leadership. And something that's really important to note is that the committee recognizes that change can happen from a grassroots perspective, so to speak. It can happen from a student body, it can happen from the ground up. And that's talked a lot about in chapter 5. But they also wanted to underscore the importance of the role of leadership. They said that leadership leaders, especially those at the very top, such as a dean, a president, a CEO, they are the ones that have the unique position to set the tone on a given organization. They can set the tone, they can set the culture, and that can inform the evenness and the amount of care and dedication and attention towards anti-racism efforts in a given institution. And so they highlight that change from the top down is important and necessary. The literature here is very clear. The research shows that culture and climate affects ADEI by determining who enters and who is willing and wanting to stay within a STEM organization. The leadership, the culture, the climate, all can have substantial impacts on performance, persistence, belonging, and well-being at the individual level. Leadership can change policy to shift the norms, the values, and the practices. And so there are a number of recommendations here, but I'm just going to highlight one for you all to see what the sort of changes that they're putting forward and what they're calling on leaders to do. So here they suggest that hiring managers, directors of human resources, and supervisors should measure and review the application, offer, and acceptance rates in their organization, among a number of factors, including salaries, resource packages, academic tracks, and titles, understanding and identifying instances of racial and ethnic discrimination in the hiring process, for example. And finally, I want to turn your attention to the research agenda. And so we were tasked with developing a research agenda that's going to help lay out what the future research is going to look like in this field. And the committee put forward what I think is something that's aspirational, it's innovative, it's necessary, it's also challenging. In doing a number of dissemination events, in particular around this particular report, a very frequent question that we get is, what do we do now? And for me, at least, the research here is very clear. We know these barriers can, in fact, have real implications for individuals' likelihood in continuing. We know that what works has been proven to be effective. There is a substantial body of evidence here, and yes, there is still work to be done. And I'm interested in hearing from you all in the comment box and just hearing your thoughts about what you think the next steps are in this field. What kind of work do you think needs to be done given the changes in our larger environment around this particular topic and where we need this to go to really achieve anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion in the way that we would like to see it. And so before I hand it over, I want to conclude with this thought that was a message of the report from the committee. They said that ADEI is not a single set of goals that allows organizations to meet and declare the work concluded. It's not a checkbox. This is something that is going to need continuous effort. It's going to require sustained effort, and it's not something that's going to be done overnight. And this is supposed to be the beginning and not the end. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Yami. And so thank you, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Emily. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Yami Naguse, and I'd like to sort of pick up the thread here. Now that we've heard about the report's conclusions and recommendations, I'll share some concrete examples about how we've applied the report's findings, conclusions, and recommendations to our internal DEI initiatives at the National Academies. Next slide, please. And so I'll share a few examples of how we're putting this evidence into practice across three broad areas of DEI work at the National Academies, and then I'll provide some additional detail on a few of the examples. Starting with the first area of staff development and resources, we've developed and launched a DEI dialogue series, as well as a number of DEI trainings for our staff, which I'll share a bit more about in detail in a moment. And then we also integrated DEI into our goal setting at the National Academies so that when staff are developing goals for the next performance review period, diversity, equity, and inclusion are a formal category where they can develop a goal that's really tailored to their job description and responsibilities, and they're able to play a part in this, larger organizational transformation as well. And then in this category of staff development and resources, we've also launched a suite of DEI toolkits and resources for our staff. And specifically following the guidance from the ADEI report and the findings around the importance of lived experience, we developed a toolkit on the value of lived experience in scientific research that provides some definitional guidance around, what is lived experience, what is the value of lived experience as a form of evidence, as well as some practical applications for staff to use in our program work moving forward. And then across all of our staff development and resources, we've identified opportunities to develop tailored resources for leadership. As Emily mentioned, the report emphasizes the role of organizational leadership in broader transformation towards DEI. And so we've developed some trainings, goal setting guidance, as well as resources for inclusive hiring for our leadership as well. In the second area, you'll see we have a Pathways program, which is an initiative that's multi-pronged. It's made up of 3 components: an internship program, a mentorship program, and a short-term residency program, all of which I'll share a bit more about in a moment. And then finally, I wanted to share the third area of alignment, which is communications and accountability. As Laura mentioned, we revised our organizational DEI statement and developed new guiding principles for our work. We've also taken a data-driven approach and launched a triannual DEI questionnaire for our staff to get a sense of attitudes and beliefs around a culture of DEI at the academies, as well as a series of listening sessions that are held on an ad hoc basis with our staff members and volunteers. And then we also launched the first National Academies DEI dashboards, which I'll also share a bit more about. Next slide, please. And so under development and resources, our DEI dialogue sessions are structured dialogue sessions held for staff, and they're intended to engage folks in an informal and open discussion format so that they can engage in dialogue around topics related to DEI and the workplace. Last summer, we partnered with the Division on Behavioral and Social Sciences and Education to host a series of virtual dialogue sessions tailored to the findings and recommendations around the ADEI report. And so we invited folks to join our office, reading the report chapter by chapter, to get a better understanding of some of the anti-racism and DEI concepts in the report, to provide an opportunity for staff to discuss how the issues of anti-racism and DEI shape our work, and then to brainstorm some strategies for applying the solutions presented in the report to ourselves as a STEM-based organization on a DEI journey. Next slide, please. We also developed a suite of DEI trainings for staff, and here we've highlighted the 3 primary DEI trainings. These were developed in collaboration with our Office of Human Resources, and you'll see in the first box on the left side, creating a respectful workplace is a standard onboarding training for staff that covers topics such as workplace behavior core values, common civility measures for collaboration, as well as etiquette for workplace communications. And then building on that, we developed an introduction to DEI training that provides some definitional guidance around, what do we mean? What's our shared understanding of DEI? The importance of DEI at the National Academies and the importance to our work, as well as describing some elements of a diverse, equitable, and inclusive workplace. Most recently, we launched a pro-social bystander intervention training for all staff, and this is facilitated by an experienced instructor who's completed special training to teach the course at the National Academies. And this training really equips participants with the tools to identify the community impact of incivility, harassment, bias, and discrimination in the workplace, as well as tools to proactively intervene with practical pro-social bystander skills so that we may work toward a culture of acknowledgement, action, and accountability. And there's training related to this topic customized for leadership as well. Next slide, please. So I mentioned our Pathways programs. The first piece of this program is the summer internship, which was launched this summer. And this provides undergrad students with an opportunity to collaborate with leading experts, to contribute to impactful research projects, and to gain experience on cutting-edge developments in sciences, engineering, and medicine. The mentorship program is open to all National Academy staff, and that's in development and will be launched with the goal to foster a culture where mentorship plays a pivotal role in individual and collective success. And that was one of our key lessons learned from the report findings as well. And then finally, the short-term residency program is also under development, and that's an initiative that's designed to foster collaborative partnerships between scholars and professionals from academic and professional institutions and the national academies. Next slide, please. Finally, I wanted to share a bit around our commitment to a data-driven approach in our DEI work. This includes the data collection, as I mentioned, the listening sessions and DEI questionnaire. But we also launched 2 DEI dashboards, one for project management so we can get a sense of timeliness and completion of the actions outlined in the DEI action plan that Laura mentioned. And a second one focused on assessing the outcomes of our DEI work. And so here you'll see a snapshot of the DEI outcomes dashboard, including some of the inputs and outputs that we are collecting. And ultimately, the end goal for us is a broader organization, transformation so that the National Academies is a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive workplace. So to that end, we developed this dashboard that examines organizational impacts and how well we're achieving our 6 goals. And hopefully we'll be able to see that we're making some progress over the 5-year period of our DEI action plan. Next slide, please. So that concludes our presentation. Hopefully we have plenty of time for Q&A. We look forward to hearing from you all. Thank you so much for having us.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Laura, Emily, Yami. So much good stuff. I can see the love and the emojis. So it's really, on behalf of SACNAS, thank you very much for sharing. And I know we're all excited to get to the Q&A. So very quickly for folks, as a reminder, if you have questions, if you can enter them in the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and I will follow those along and ask the questions for you. And if you submitted a question when you registered, I have those as well. So I'll kind of go back and forth. But I think we'll just get started with the first question here, a question from Carla. So she asked, how are the academies handling or empowering academic institutions and other organizations to follow on the recommendations, given the current policy climate that's outlawing anti-racism work? Big question.
I can go first, and then Emily, you may want to talk about how, as you go and present and meet with other organizations, how they're using the recommendations. Well, first and foremost, we produce scientific evidence. And so this is why we do the work that we do, so that people have the evidence on the variety of topics that we do research on. And so that's how we are able to contribute. The second point I would make is to ensure that you follow the evidence, right? This is more than just the right thing to do or a nice thing to do. There's tons of research that show the impact that DEI have. So when possible, rely on the evidence, use that knowledge and develop evidence-based strategies. And so that's what we've done in our action plan. That's what leads our work. And I think the third area I would add that Yami just covered, take data-driven approaches, right? When possible, collect data, evaluate your work, evaluate the impact, so that you have data that demonstrates if you are making progress or not, and if you need to pivot and try something differently. So again, follow the evidence when possible, use the guidance that is out there, and track things, right? Gather metrics and evaluate the impact of your work. So those are some broad. I know that may not be helpful to everyone, and we're in some folks may be under different circumstances. But Emily, you may have some additional words of wisdom, given your work with a variety of institutions out there.
Thank you so much. Yeah, absolutely. So for context for everyone, we've done a number of dissemination events going around the country and talking to a lot of colleges and universities about this report, and the landscape has shifted since we started doing our dissemination work when it was released in 2023. But in having conversations with a number of institutions, what's clear are a couple of points. One is that everyone's coming into this from a different sort of spot. So what Laura was saying was like everyone's barriers look a little bit different, and so the solutions are going to be a little bit different depending on the place in which people are located. And so with that, the committee recognized that even from the start, even before this report was written. And the way in which they set up the report was supposed to be, you're taking on a simultaneous, multi-tiered approach to the recommendations. And so it's not just, here's the silver bullet that's going to solve everyone's problems everywhere in the US, but rather it's about understanding where your gaps are, what your particular issues are, and then taking a multi-tiered approach, understanding, okay, what can be changed at an interpersonal level, as we talk about in Chapter 5. Okay, what can be changed then at a leadership level when we look at Chapter 8 and think about organizational level structures. And they're supposed to be done simultaneously because, and depending on where you are, some things may be likely to stick and really work, and some things less so. I will highlight one recommendation that I think has received a lot of attention because I think it's worked pretty well for a number of institutions in a number of states, is the one about forming partnerships with minority serving institutions. This is something that I think a lot of communities hadn't thought of necessarily before, but they're like, oh, you know, we can go talk to our colleagues right down the road. We know that there's this institution here, it's an MSI, and this is a great way to start. We can just pick up the phone tonight and, you know, begin a conversation. And so that, I think, is something they saw as, this is something that we can do immediately. And we can also look into doing these other recommendations as well.
Thank you so much. I see a couple different questions around these same lines, so I'm going to try to cluster them a little together. But I'm gonna read one, and I think it will kind of cover several questions just about that, the issue of anti-DEI legislation. And so the question at the top here is, my colleagues at public institutions in states that do not allow DEI work, Florida, Texas, etc., are really nervous about doing anti-racism work because they fear for their jobs. What can we do, and how can we support them from less politically charged locations? And there's, you know, other questions about recommendations for people in those states, and it sounds like for people not in those states. So if you can answer that question.
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, one of the things that I know, find networks, right? Find organizations, conferences, I think, Emily, you alluded to this, colleagues that are in similar situations, right? This is the time to go and hear different perspectives, different approaches, and work together. And internally, right? Work with legal counsel, work with your colleagues from across the institution to see what you can do and what you cannot do. But I know I always, even as for professional development, right? We're always seeking professional development, right? We don't just get to a point and we're done. I always try to go to different types of conferences, especially in the DI space, and learn how private sector folks are thinking about these issues. How is the medical community thinking about these issues? So I always try to go to those different spaces and to try to get pieces of information and knowledge that I hopefully can apply. I don't know, Emily or Yami, if you have anything else to add to that, but I think this is a time to sort of, you know, surround yourself and learn and try to, you know, work with colleagues across your institution and to reach out beyond your walls as well.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. I might add that taking an intersectional approach to the work can help increase impact and reach, right? As we know that folks from historically marginalized backgrounds often have multiple marginalized identities. And so, for example, one priority area for our office that we didn't get to cover in the slide set is accessibility. And that's not something that folks might inherently think of something as DEI, but it really is, and you know, in its nature. And accessibility and belonging is something that everyone can get behind, right? It's very far-reaching and is something that any organization, whether it's academic institutions, nonprofits, private sector, can and should be prioritizing. And so maybe broadening your approach to a more intersectional lens might help bring on more partners and buy-in across different sort of areas.
Wonderful, thank you. I think one of the things that seemed very interesting about the report was not just the questions about organizations, but also on the individual and the listening sessions. I think people were very fascinated by that. And so I'm wondering, I'm trying to combine a couple questions again, but if there were things learned in the report about how people felt on overcoming racist experience that they had, recovering or addressing it within themselves.
That's a great question. And I'm just going to point back to chapter 5 because that's where we cover the science of how is it perpetrated, what kind of impacts exist, but also how do individuals respond. And so something that I think is particularly interesting is that there is a section of that chapter in the report that talks about how a group of individuals came together to collectively mobilize and change their local environment using social media and other technologies. And I think that's a really fascinating example. As far as recovering from racist experiences, we don't cover that too much. However, there is a call in the end in the research agenda to talk about maybe there needs to be more effort and emphasis on understanding when we can make mental health services more available. Because the focus of this report is understanding the larger structural factors that gave rise to structural racism, instances of interpersonal racism, and we didn't focus as much on recovering from individual experiences. But I think this is something that they were definitely highlighting as a future area of research.
I might also add that at the National Academies, we've really focused on building community and fellowship for our staff. And so whether that's through employee resource groups, wherever you're situated, or finding sort of other experts, scholars, researchers, students of shared identity, mentorship programs, right? Like finding your community and being able to have that safe place is certainly playing a role in our organization.
Thank you. Another question kind of on what's included in the report. This one is from the chat. Alex asks, does the report review assessment tools used to evaluate DEI measures with STEM industry orgs that work with or employ youth? Do you have recommendations for organizations set up systems to track and monitor that data?
That is a fantastic question. We don't have detailed assessments like that. However, I am going to point to the 9 different frameworks that were offered in the beginning of the report. I believe they're actually in the summary. And so, like I mentioned before, the committee recognized that different institutions come to this at a different sort of level with different sort of barriers. And so they didn't want to offer, here's the one tool that you should take with you. And so they provided 9 different frameworks on how to think about evaluating in a broad sort of definition of how you can look at your organization, understand where the problems are, and then take action. And this is describing those frameworks in a very high level and a very generalized sort of way. But I think that's probably the closest thing to what this individual is asking here in this question. But I recommend taking a look at those 9 frameworks because those have been published, those have been within the empirical literature, and it's something that has been proven to be effective.
Thank you. Our next question here is again asking for some suggestions. We have people joining from different areas across the country. And so this question asks, do you have suggestions for support that the National Academies and state, federal, tribal, municipal governments can provide to students, faculty, and staff in rural areas?
I can start with that. I think Yami got me thinking with the way she responded to the previous question. I hope that rural areas and individuals that come from those communities are also seen as part of this DEI work. And one of the things, in our work and others doing work in this space should look at those perspectives. We should look at health equity and include rural communities, right? When we do work around educational opportunities, we should look at individuals that live in rural communities. And when we do a number of reports looking at different types of institutions, MSIs and other types of institutions, we should be looking at those communities as well. So, our understanding of diversity is broad and is inclusive of those communities. And so I hope that our work reflects that and others that do work in the space as well.
Thank you. Our next question here is maybe along a little bit of the same lines. It starts in the spirit of finding networks and building those coalitions. What resources does your office offer to connect DEI professionals in STEM spaces to strengthen cross-institutional efforts that would align with the report's recommendations?
So I know we have a number of other reports that I believe cover this topic. I know we do work in the space of mentorship and professional development and sponsorship. And so to me, that would be critical to be included in that guidance that's provided there. I'm trying to read the rest of the question here.
Yes. For example, will the short-term residency program that is in development be an opportunity for DEI professionals in STEM to come together to share practices?
Yeah. So that's, I know when Yami shared sort of our plans, we have an internship program, mentorship program, and short-term residency as well, right? To provide opportunities for, at least in this case, here at the National Academies, for folks to come and spend time with us, right? To learn from us and partner with us, but also to be able to take that knowledge back to their respective institution, that they come from.
And apologies, I was having trouble coming off mute. One other thing that I would add is that, as Laura mentioned, the National Academies does have a really diverse range of work. And so the report that we are presenting on is a consensus study report, but we do have a large number of convening activities like webinars, workshops, roundtables, and forums. And increasingly, we've seen that they are taking on issues related to DEI and STEM. And those are really wonderful opportunities for STEM professionals to engage across sectors and disciplines. And so absolutely recommend that you visit our webpage at nationalacademies.org for future workshops and other convening activities that might be an opportunity to connect and enhance some of your networks.
And Daniela, I saw a couple of questions here about some of the resources that Yami highlighted. Unfortunately, right now, they are only for internal purposes. We are hoping in the future to make some of these resources available. However, we're more than happy to have discussions with you around our resources and have discussions with you. So feel free to reach out to me or Yami or Emily, and we can certainly do that. But unfortunately, these resources, they're not ready yet for an external audience.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And I think that might be a great place to conclude our Q&A. I know there's a few we didn't get to, so thank you for everyone who submitted questions and has really engaged with this important work. This gets to the heart of one of the reasons SACNAS is here. So we very much value your sharing with us today on behalf of SACNAS and our members. Thank you very much to our speakers. I am going to share one last slide here with next steps. If I can share my screen. Here we go. And I'm going to put some links in the chat for those who would like to access the report as well. So let me pop those in the chat. So again, thank you to today's speakers very much. I put 2 links in the chat that we'll also be sending via email along with the recording, so you have access to those to dig a little deeper and see how you might leverage this at your home institution or in your local communities. So do look out for that follow-up email. At the end of this webinar, you will be prompted with a survey for feedback. We really appreciate the time that you take to provide feedback on this topic, others, and so that we may improve future webinars for you. And then, of course, we hope you will stay connected with SACNAS. There's information on our website about joining SACNAS, becoming a member, and engaging in future conversations like this. So thank you very much. Once again, Lauda, Emily, Yami, thank you so much for being here today. We appreciate all the time and thoughtful sharing that you've done today. Another little virtual round of applause and hearts for y'all. Thank you very much. That concludes today's webinar, and we will see you next time. Thank you again.